is VIII Lacrimosa of Dana, a game I played because I was in the mood for a long JRPG, and after having finished Figment on Stadia, I was ready to try something bigger. And so of course I went from playing a 3-hour game to an over 30-hour one. And actually, when I went to pick out this game, I had two options. This is 8 and Trails of Cold Steel 3, but after a quick Google search, it turns out the latter is a continuation of the Trails series stories, and it's very not beginner friendly, while is 8, despite the name and being the 8th mainline game in the series, it's also very much its own self-contained story, which I guess it's normal for big JRPG franchises like Final Fantasy and SMT. But even in that genre, this game does seem to have a bit of a unique story, even if it still abides by a lot of the tropes by this same genre. So let's actually get into the review, starting of course with the story. In Ys 8 you play as Adol, the main character of many Ys games, as he's in a ship sailing close to a mythical island that is said to be impossible to reach, as the sea around it mysteriously sinks boats. And of course, almost immediately after receiving this information, a giant creature attacks the boat, leading to a wreck that ends with our main character waking up ashore the island. And this is where the game really starts, as you find other survivors and build camp and plan how you're going to rescue yourselves, while also discovering the secrets of the island, which end up being the bigger piece of the plot. And honestly, I found this concept very unique. It's not unusual for Japanese JRPGs to put you in a different world or generally hostile areas as their main setting, but the idea of the stranded island I just never seen before, and here it's used in a great way as you get to set pace and then protect it and even keep expanding it through the game by exploring the island. So the part of the plot about trying to survive and finding a way to leave feeds into the other part of the plot about the secret of the island, which I think is clever and I enjoyed that. But also, of course, the more survival aspects of this game are very light, as your base is never getting raided and completely destroyed. It's very much your average action RPG in terms of gameplay, but these new gimmicks do really add both to the story engagement and also gameplay, but of course more on the gameplay later. Now, it's hard to keep talking about the story without spoiling, but there are some stuff I have to address, and I swear some of the criticism here will make more sense in the gameplay bit, and the major one here is not all characters get enough screen time, so they end up feeling underdeveloped. I mean, some of the survivors don't show up until almost the very end of the game, and while there is a purpose for this, which we'll talk about a bit later, but still, even with this purpose, it's still in my eyes a failure story-wise, as whenever one of these characters try to have a more intimate scene, it just falls flat. The other issue, more on a personal basis, and it might affect you too, is that this game does fall into a lot of anime tropes, which is fine to an extent. It didn't bother me too much, but it's still something you should be aware of, especially with some very overtly sexual scenes in a game that for the most part is very wholesome. I mean, there is this one side mission where the reward is basically the non-NPC gets a sexier outfit, which isn't the worst thing ever. I'm not a prude, but it does feel very weird to say the least. Also, there is a lot of big Jurassic Park inspirations beyond the obvious one that I will not spoil, but I don't know, that's just something I found funny and I thought I would mention. Regardless, my final criticism of the story is the mystery of the island is underwhelming, to say the least. While it creates some interesting gameplay scenes, it is for the most part a very generic JRPG plot. Unless this is your first game in the genre, you will just immediately recognize a lot of plot points and story beats. And if it wasn't for that more unique side of the story, I don't know if I would have enjoyed the journey so much as I did. But I still enjoyed it, so that's good. As again, that stranded plot is refreshing, and the characters who play a big part into that are endearing, at least the ones that get enough development. Overall though, it's a good story despite its cliches, and while I try not to spoil much, here I think with the gameplay you will get maybe a better context to things I said. And so now we move on to the gameplay. Being an action RPG, which surprisingly the Ys series has always been, it's not the first action RPG, but it's surprising in the way that I feel a lot of major JRPGs from the 80s and 90s still coming out today have adopted the action genre along the way. Most notably, of course, the Final Fantasy series. But not really important here, just something I thought was interesting. So let's get back into the actual gameplay of this game. Basic control wise, you can move in 3D space with the analog stick and move the camera with the right one, but interesting to mention here, there are a few boss fights that lock the camera to a certain angle in what I believe is a reference to older Ys games, which is a cool little detail. Now talking a bit more about the specific moves of our characters. Yes, you're able to control different characters, which is important to say because it wasn't until Ys VII that the series started having party members. At least that's what my research told me, as this was my first Ys game. Regardless, here you can change between one of your 3 active party members with the press of a button, and when you do, it's like the character you change to changes places with the one you're playing with. It's not like, for example, in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, where you jump to the character and keep doing what they're actively doing when changing the character. Regardless of that, every character can jump and dodge and block, which when pressed right before an enemy attack, making everything go slow motion, except you and your character, this being called Flash Move and Flash Card, which serve for dodging and blocking respectively. Which my only problem here is that there is no animation for the guard one, as the reason for that is probably because your guard button is also used to activate your special attacks, and that makes sense, but still a bit weird. Also, the whole mechanic is just not very original, even if that might not be a bad thing. Anyways, getting back to the characters then, they can also use normal attacks of course and use special attacks. Now these special attacks can be activated by pressing the guard button again and one of the face buttons, so to a total of 4 you can have actively during combat. And these do vary from character to character, and you can acquire different skills simply by playing with that character and its skills. Also, I might say skills or special attacks, but they mean the same thing in this context. You can also receive them through side missions, and there is an incentive to use these special attacks even beyond the main reason that they do extra damage, and that is that you can level up these skills, giving them usually just more damage, which is fine. There's already a big variety of skills with different ranges and patterns of attack that makes so you would want mostly just more power from whatever thing you're trying to level up. Now, the special attacks also work by spending SP, which you can gain from simply using regular attacks or by other means like items and special equipment. Speaking of these special attacks though, there is one even more special attack. This one, which works on its own separate bar, more of a circle here, that fills up by using regular special attacks. So basically normal attacks allow you to do then special attacks, and doing a lot of special attacks will then allow you to do an ultimate attack of sorts. Also to note about this ultimate attack is that it freezes characters, enemy characters I mean, so while you're doing it, they don't move out of the way or attack you back, for example. The only major problem with this attack is that in the base controls, you activate it by pressing the dodge and the block button at the same time, which you would think wouldn't be a problem if only guard wasn't also used to activate the special attacks. It is very easy to mispress, especially when trying to go from a dodge to a special attack, and it's really annoying. Thankfully, if you're playing on PC or Stadia in my case, you can just easily remap these individually, which is a big deal. By this I mean you can put the ultimate attack to a completely different set of buttons or even just a button. It doesn't have to be dodge plus guard. Now, continuing to talk about the characters, another thing they can all use, and this is in my opinion one of the coolest bits about the game, and that is the advanced gear. Basically, what this does is allow you to do special abilities within the open world, not so much in combat, to overcome obstacles like climbing up vines or breathing underwater. It adds almost a Metroidvania feel to the progression of the game, and it's honestly really good, even for me who isn't a huge fan of the Metroidvania genre. Also, another thing that adds to this feel that already hinted at in the story bit is finding survivors, as some areas will be locked off, and the way to unlock them is by gathering a certain number of these survivors to help you clear the way. Some of these paths are integral to the story, but some might also just have rare and valuable items. Of course, I already said my piece about the problem this system creates, but I think that overall it is a worth it trade-off for the type of progression this game is going for. Speaking of progression, of course, you level up like in any other RPG by fighting enemies or using special items, but here items also have a big hit on your stats, and while there's a few different types of equipable items, I will simplify it here as they mostly do the same things, as some can change your base stats, health, strength and defense, or change certain aspects of the game like making special attacks cheaper, or have rarer items drop more often, or have your attacks inflict some ailments like poison or freeze. Very standard in that way. But getting back to our characters once again though, to finish this bit off about them, you have a total of 6 party members, 2 of each type of attack attribute. These are slash, strike and pierce, and usually you'd want one character for each one of those types, as some enemies are weak to specific types while being resistant to the others. This also giving you a reason to switch around characters during combat, as there really is no reason to do it during just exploration. Now, if I can say something about the AI of the characters you are not controlling, is that it's fairly simplistic, but they work. As in, when you attack, they will also attack. You can set them to offensive and defensive mode, but that doesn't seem to be a reason to use defensive mode aside from conserving their health, because at least here in normal difficulty, which I played in, characters you are not actively playing with cannot die. But to curb this being too overpowered, even if it still is either way, since you don't have to revive them and can just heal them, which is a lot cheaper. But regardless, when you do reach that point where they otherwise would have fainted, they will just not participate in the fight and just run around not doing anything. At least I think that's what happens, as I only had that happen once, as I will now lead to talk about the difficulty. This game is fairly easy. Like I said, there are plenty of noob friendly mechanics like the one I just mentioned, and others like just being able to teleport to a checkpoint at any time, and checkpoints fully healing you and even reviving you. And these features are also in the harder difficulties, so what really changes is just how hard enemies are, and so it's a bit odd in that way, but it's still on normal. I found myself being able to just plow through most enemies and even be able to stand against enemies above my own level. And while I did do a lot of side quests to the point where I almost 100%ed it unintentionally, I still think that if you're looking for a challenging game, starting at hard or even higher might be a better option. And there is no big drawback since you can change difficulty options at will. And like I said before, I was somewhat over leveled by doing side quests and exploring, but I think that this applies here as well because these are things that you're gonna be wanting to do, especially if you're like me and you enjoy the stranded aspect of the story more, as the side quests are for the most part about helping out your camp and its inhabitants in some way, with missions like go gather X or kill Y enemy because it's a threat to the village. And you might think that I'm describing fetch quests right now, which I am, but I think in this frame it just works a lot better because, well, you're trying to survive while also trying to leave the island, and also these missions do end up giving a lot of character development for the characters in this makeshift village, and that helps fetch quest being a lot easier to swallow, of course. And also, of course, you have the incentive of the average rewards you get from these types of games, like crafting materials, here being a big part of the game as you can craft, cook and brew most equipable and usable items in this game. And you can only do this at the base, except for cooking, which you can do at certain checkpoints that have a small camp that you set up for your active party. They are sort of useless because fast traveling is so easy, but I guess they help with the immersion if not anything else. Now, quickly mentioning consumable items before we move on to the final feature of the gameplay. As you can probably guess, what these do is give you health or temporary stat bonuses. Some of them, more rare items, can just give you permanent health and stat upgrades. Now, these consumable items are divided into some groups where I'm gonna try and explain now. First we have potions, something that you can use at will. Something that you can't use at will is cooked food, as you fill up after eating one prepared meal. This makes sense from a balancing standpoint, as you can't abuse potions because you have a limited amount of them, since each potion expands a flask to put it in, and those are surprisingly rare and expensive to craft in this game. And the limit on the food does stop you from abusing it, especially since they both heal and give you some stats or ability bonuses. These can be circumvented by using another consumable item, the drinks, which allow you to immediately eat another dish, but also losing the bonus from the previous one. And this one again being balanced by only being able to carry 10 drinks, so you can't abuse the food as a healing item. And up until now this seems all fine, like everything has something to stop you from abusing it or relying too much on it. But then there is fruit, another expendable item that just does not have any limit at all, and in fact it's easier to farm than any of the other consumable items, as you don't have to craft them and simply find them in the world in specific locations that are also marked on the map. The only reason to not consume these fruits is to gather enough of them to craft a ripe fruit that works as a revive. In fact, most things are marked on the map, another very noob friendly feature and probably one of the reasons I almost 100%ed this game, which is a nice feature overall. In my opinion, the only problem with the map is there are two of them, and when trying to use them there's just an odd disparity between them, so sometimes trying to orient yourself can be a bit of a nuisance, where it would have just been better to have a single map that could zoom in and out completely. But what is here is fine enough, I guess. At least there is a button that just orientates the smaller map north, which matches it better with the bigger one. And I understand that the reason there isn't two maps is probably from a technical side, as one map is a more artistic depiction while another is more of a outline of the actual level. So I'm not like criticizing it too much, hopefully. Now on to the actual final thing about the game, and that is the raids and hunts. These pertain to defending your base, and these are both optional and sometimes not so optional, being part of the main story. And they put you in an area fighting waves of enemies, stopping them from reaching the village in the raids, and in the hunts actually going out there and destroying nests of monsters, presumably so they invade you less. The raid ones here being the most interesting ones, as you can also upgrade your defenses, adding things like bait to distract the attacking monsters, or adding catapults that more actively attack the enemies, among other things. And these can get very powerful as they are permanent upgrades. Not even joking, it's not like you could just let the defense do all the work, but when they are well leveled up, they do make these waves a lot easier. And I think that's a nice balance. You want to feel like it matters that you are fighting, but also that the defenses you're spending a lot of red items on also do something. And overall, I enjoyed it. Even if I feel they could have made it a bit faster paced, which would have added to the difficulty, maybe that's why they didn't do it. And of course, because it's always in the same places, and so there is an inherent repetitiveness to it that you need to be aware of. But overall, the gameplay is really fun. It feels balanced, even with some oddities, and my experience having been fairly easy, I didn't mind it at all. It feels as if the story props up the gameplay and the gameplay props up the story in a lot of ways, especially in the aspects I already said I enjoyed the most. Even when you consider that maybe when stripped down this game would be a fairly average action RPG gameplay wise. Now, speaking about the graphics, I'll be honest, it's not the nicest looking game in the world. It very much looks like it could have ran fine on the PS3 with some really flat and low res textures and fairly simple character models. They kinda just look like generic anime characters, which is a bit annoying honestly. Visually, this isn't the most interesting game ever. Even the monster designs here are a bit uninspired, except for the bosses. Those are pretty good, and I didn't mention it in the gameplay, but the bosses are definitely a highlight of the game, just because of how different they are, move-wise and design-wise. But regardless, even looking somewhat generic, I'll be honest, there is a bit of an endearing quality to the characters, which does help, and even for what is mostly a tropical island, there is still a fair variety of locations without anything feeling out of place, which is really good. It may look like a PS3 game, but it would have looked like a really good PS3 game. Now, moving on to a more technical sense, playing on the Stadia was fine. For the most part, the game ran at a good resolution, but I will say that in this specific case, the color problems that came from the compression were more annoying, as they would often stick to the UI. And again, much like in my last review, the thing with Stadia is, even at a high resolution, you can't tell the compression, and like I said in that video, it looks like you're playing through a YouTube video, which is something important to take into consideration. Now, soundtrack wise, I'll be honest, I don't have much to say about it. It's fine. There are some standout tracks that do sound pretty good to me, but a lot of it also just seems serviceable. It sounded good, but that's about it. And I feel bad saying that because it is good music, just didn't have a unique or prevailing sound that stood out to me, and it kinda sounds like any other JRPG. And that is in a lot of ways how this game comes off as. If you look at it at face value, this would be a very generic JRPG, and maybe that's the reason I never thought to play it before this situation. But with a unique premise and a fairly enjoyable gameplay loop around that premise, and some really enjoyable progression with the Metroidvania elements, make for something that does really stand out to me in a positive way, and that I end up enjoying a lot. And for that, I am giving Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana an 8 out of 10. Haha. Recommendations wise, well, if you are in the same situation as me, and if you have a decent internet connection, then absolutely go for it. If not, though, be aware of the anime cliches and tropes that this game has, and if that is something that might bother you. And of course, if you enjoy the general gameplay of Japanese action RPGs, which can feel very mindless at times, and it might not be for everyone, but to be fair, this is a very engaging one with its dodging mechanics. Price wise though, it's probably cheap. Ys 9 just came out, so I guess this one, being a bit older and not the new game, would be a lot cheaper, so maybe look into that. And also, when considering what console to play on, well, there is PC, which I always recommend, and supposedly this is a fairly good port on PC, and because it's not very graphically challenging though, probably any platform runs this game just fine, so but this was a review of the Stadia version, so be aware of that. If you're looking for another console, maybe look up something like a frame rate analysis, something that just lets you know for sure that the game runs well on the platform you choose to play it on. Regardless of your decision though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing and liking and even commenting, all the things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you are having a good day, and goodbye.